Hello, and welcome to Science with Mr. Morgan. In today's episode, we will be reviewing cell biology. To start, there are two basic cell types: prokaryotic cells and eukaryotic cells. Prokaryotic cells do not have a nucleus. Instead, their DNA is free-floating around their cells. They also do not have membrane-bound organelles, but they do have a plasma membrane. Their organelles include ribosomes, cytoplasm, and DNA. Prokaryotes are single-celled organisms, which include bacteria or archaea. An example of a prokaryotic cell that you may have heard of is Streptococcus pyogenes. Not ringing any bells? Have you ever heard of or had strep throat? Streptococcus pyogenes is the bacteria that causes strep. Eukaryotic cells, on the other hand, have a nucleus which is membrane-bound and surrounding their DNA, which can be coiled into one chromosome or over 100. They also have membrane-bound organelles. These organelles include ribosomes, cytoplasm, mitochondria, endoplasmic reticulum, and Golgi apparatus, just to name a few. Eukaryotes can be similar to prokaryotes in the sense that some are single-celled organisms, while others are multicellular. Now, there are many examples of eukaryotic cells. Look down at your arm. You could see some skin, possibly even some hair. The cells that make up each of these are eukaryotic cells. They are a couple of the different cell types that make up us, right? We're made of more than skin cells and more than hair cells. For single-celled eukaryotes, an example is yeast, the stuff you may have used to make bread. Yeast can be multicellular, but it is predominantly single-celled. Now that we've talked about the two basic types of cells, let's talk about some of the organelles. So starting off with the cell membrane, this is also called the plasma membrane. It's used interchangeably between the two. It is made up of a phospholipid bilayer. Phospholipids are referring to fats, aka lipids, that have a phosphate group attached to them. The phospholipids have a hydrophilic head and a hydrophobic tail, or tails. The hydrophilic head loves water, but the hydrophobic tail is afraid of it, and this is why it forms a bilayer, or two layers. On the top layer, the hydrophilic heads face up and the hydrophobic tails face down. On the bottom layer, the hydrophobic tails face up, right by the other tails, and the hydrophilic heads face down. This puts the hydrophilic heads in contact with the water surrounding it and within the cell, while the tails are protected from the water itself in that middle layer. This phospholipid bilayer controls what can enter and exit the cells. It's semi-permeable, which means that some things can go through it and some things can't. Certain things can pass through the membrane itself, like gases and steroids, but other things require assistance. Within the phospholipid bilayer, there are proteins that can act as channels, or pumps, that let things of certain sizes go through. Channels move based on how much stuff is on one side or the other, while pumps use ATP, aka energy, to pump it across, even if there's not room. Next up is the cytosol. This is a jelly-like substance found within the cells. It's made up of water and other various molecules like enzymes. You may have heard of the term cytoplasm, which refers to the cytosol plus organelles. Now, whenever I think about cytoplasm, I always think about those Jell-O cake type things that have fruit inside of them. The Jell-O part is the cytosol, and the fruit being held in place is the organelles. Now, within the cytosol itself is the cytoskeleton, which gives the cell its shape, just like how our skeleton gives us our shape. Instead of being made of bones, though, the cytoskeleton is made of microtubules, actin, and intermediate filaments. All of that being said, the cytosol does not include the nucleus in eukaryotic cells. It does, however, include DNA in prokaryotic cells since they don't have a nucleus. Speaking of the nucleus, let's talk about that next. The nucleus is found only in eukaryotic cells and contains most of the genetic material, aka the DNA, of the cell. DNA is the set of instructions that allows the cell to function, and it's surrounded by a nuclear envelope, which is a double layer like the cell membrane. Also like the cell membrane, The nuclear envelope controls what goes in and out of the nucleus. It's got these holes called nuclear pores, which is what allow things to come in or to come out depending on their size. Chromosomes, which contain DNA, or their wound version of DNA, are found inside the nucleus, and they're made up of strands of DNA coiled around proteins. Now, these strands have genes that code for proteins which are required for organisms to function. There are hundreds to thousands of genes on each chromosome. Us humans have 46 chromosomes total. We get 23 from our mom and 23 from our dad. Now, besides chromosomes, the nucleus also contains the nucleolus. Ribosomes are built here, which then flow out of the nuclear pores into the cytoplasm. When they're out in the cytoplasm, ribosomes may or may not be membrane-bound. They're typically not, though. These ribosomes make proteins for the cell and for your body to use. I know I just mentioned that ribosomes are typically not membrane-bound. However, some of them are attached to the endoplasmic reticulum. Now, there are two kinds of endoplasmic reticulum. The first kind is known as smooth endoplasmic reticulum, or smooth ER for short. This kind does not have ribosomes attached to it, hence why it's called smooth, and it creates lipids, or fats, for the cell. The kind of endoplasmic reticulum that the ribosomes are attached to is known as the rough endoplasmic reticulum, or rough ER. It's called that because the ribosomes make it bumpy and rough, kind of like sandpaper if you've ever looked at it or touched it. Now, instead of lipids like the smooth ER makes, the rough ER creates proteins, which are then modified, packaged into vesicles, and sent to the Golgi apparatus. In order to function, like making proteins, cells need energy. In cells, energy is produced as adenosine triphosphate, which is also called ATP. Now, this ATP is produced in what's called the mitochondria, which are known as the powerhouse of the cell. They're like an energy factory for the cell, but instead of using things like wind to produce energy like windmills do, they use a process called cellular respiration to produce energy. Certain cells require more energy to function, and the more energy that a cell uses, the more mitochondria a cell has. Some of our cells use so much energy that they have thousands of mitochondria present. Next up are vesicles. These are small membrane-bound sacs that transport materials around the cell into the cell membrane to exit the cell. You can think of vesicles kind of like the mail service. It transports mail and delivers packages to where they need to go. Now, similar to vesicles are lysosomes. They're similar in the sense that they each carry things, but instead of delivering packages, lysosomes are more like a garbage truck. Inside of the lysosome, there are digestive enzymes that break down molecules into parts that can then be recycled. Next up, let's talk about vacuoles. Vacuoles are essentially storage containers for cells. Plant cells have larger vacuoles than animal cells, and it uses their large central vacuole to store water and nutrients. Now, earlier I mentioned something called the Golgi apparatus. This organelle receives proteins from the rough endoplasmic reticulum and packages them into vesicles. From there, it ships them to the right place in the cell or to the cell membrane. At the cell membrane, some proteins are secreted from the cell, which means it leaves the cell, while others are added to the cell membrane itself. And with that, it brings us to the end of today's lesson. Until next time.